My hands are closing around her throat, and I am screaming. The scream has no sound. It exists only in the space behind my eyes, in whatever fragment of consciousness they left intact when they opened my skull and rewired the parts that used to be mine. My fingers tighten with mechanical precision, each kilogram of pressure calculated by systems I do not control, applied with a grace I no longer possess. The woman beneath me tries to breathe. She cannot. Her eyes are wide, reflecting the failing lumen that flickers overhead in this nameless corridor on this forgotten hive world. I can see my reflection in those eyes. I do not recognize what I have become. The smell hits me with perfect clarity. Fear sweat, acrid and sharp, mixed with the recycled air that tastes of rust and promethium. The corridor is narrow, painted in that institutional gray that exists in every hab block across every world in the Imperium. Somewhere above us, machinery groans. Somewhere below, voices murmur prayers to the God Emperor. And here, in this threshold between levels, my body performs its function while my mind watches in horror. Her pulse drums against my augmented fingers. I can feel it slowing. 90 beats per minute. 80. 70. The targeting optics that replaced my eyes feed me information I do not want. Oxygen deprivation calculated. Time to unconsciousness measured. Time to death predicted with cold certainty. My body adjusts its grip without conscious thought, applying pressure to the carotid arteries with surgical exactness. This is not murder. This is engineering. I try to stop. I focus every fragment of will I still possess on loosening my grip, on pulling away, on doing anything other than what I am commanded to do. My fingers do not respond. They belong to someone else now. To something else. To the Imperium's vast machinery that turns people into tools, and tools into weapons, and weapons into ghosts that cannot even haunt their own flesh. The woman's struggle is weakening. Her hands, which had clawed at my wrists, fall to her sides. I feel the cartilage in her throat beginning to give way beneath the pressure. There is a sound. Wet. Final. The kind of sound you never forget, even when you have forgotten your own name. Especially then. She goes limp. My hands do not release immediately. The protocols demand confirmation. 5 additional seconds of pressure to ensure termination. I count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each second is an eternity. Each second I am complicit. Each second I am a passenger in a vehicle of flesh and metal that was once called human. When my hands finally open, her body slides down the wall and settles on the cold deck plating. My body is already moving, executing the extraction protocol with the same inhuman efficiency it brought to the killing. I step over her without looking down. My augmented legs carry me through the shadows with perfect silence. My combat systems scan for witnesses, for threats, for complications. There are none. This kill was clean, professional, exactly what I was made to do. And that is the horror. Not that I killed her. Not that my hands crushed the life from someone whose name I do not know, whose crime I was not told, whose face will join the parade of others I have ended without choice or question. The horror is that I am good at this, that whatever they cut away and whatever they installed in its place has made me into something flawless in its lethality. I am a weapon that remembers what it was like to be a man. I am a ghost trapped in a machine of meat and augmetics. I am consciousness without agency, awareness without control, memory without mercy. I am screaming, and the scream has no sound. This is what it means to be unmade. But I was not always this. There was a time when the hands were mine. I was an operative in service to Inquisitor Hadrian Vex of the Ordo Hereticus, not a sanctioned assassin of the great temples, not one of the legendary killers whose names are whispered in fear across the galaxy. I was something quieter, something useful. A blade kept sharp and ready in the shadows of the Inquisition's vast machinery, deployed when subtlety mattered more than spectacle, when a heretic needed to vanish without raising questions that might disturb the fragile faith of the masses. I was good at my work. Exceptional, my handler once told me, in that flat tone he used for stating facts rather than offering praise. I had been trained in the fortress on Ghast, in chambers so deep beneath the surface that the weight of stone above felt like the hand of the Emperor himself pressing down in blessing. The instructors were former Assassinorum rejects, men and women who had failed the trials of the great temples, but retained enough skill to shape lesser killers into functional tools. They taught me to move through crowds without being seen, to read faces for signs of corruption, to end a life with minimum noise and maximum efficiency. I believed in the work. That part is important to understand. I was not coerced or broken into service. I volunteered. I took the oaths before a chaplain in a chapel lit by candles made from rendered corpse starch, and I meant every word. The Emperor protects, and I was his instrument of protection. Every heretic I removed was a cancer excised before it could spread. Every traitor I silenced was a potential rebellion prevented. My hands were stained with blood, but it was righteous blood, spilled in service of something greater than any individual life. There were rituals before each mission. I would spend an hour in meditation before the golden Aquila in my quarters, a small shrine I maintained with oils blessed by the fortress chaplain. I would clean my weapons with sacred unguents, whispering the litanies of accuracy and lethality that had been passed down through generations of faithful killers. My bolt pistol was a relic, older than I was, its casing inscribed with names of previous bearers who had served with honor. Holding it felt like holding history, like being part of something ancient and holy. My mentor was a woman named Cassia. She had served Inquisitor Vex for 40 years before age, and injury forced her into training roles. She taught me that killing was not cruelty, but mercy, that a clean death was a gift we gave to those who had strayed from the Emperor's light. She would review my mission reports with the same attention a scholar gave to sacred texts, noting where I had hesitated, where I had been efficient, where I had allowed emotion to cloud tactical judgment. When she told me I was ready for solo operations, I felt pride swell in my chest like a physical thing. I remember the satisfaction of a mission completed perfectly, the walk back through empty streets as dawn broke over a hive city, knowing that somewhere behind me, a corruption had been ended before it could spread. The weight of my pistol at my hip, still warm from firing. The taste of recaf in a dingy cafe where no one looked twice at another tired worker starting their shift. These moments were mine. The choices were mine. The purpose was mine. I believed my service would be eternal. I was right, but not in the way I imagined. The mission that ended everything began like all the others. The target was a cult leader operating in the lower hive of Tertium Primaris, a man named Davos Crane who had been spreading sedition disguised as labor reform. My orders were simple: locate, confirm, eliminate. No witnesses, no complications. The kind of operation I had executed dozens of times before. I descended into the underhive with confidence that felt, in retrospect, like the last breath before drowning. I found Crane in a hab unit that smelled of mildew and desperation, surrounded by workers whose eyes held the hollow look of people who had nothing left to lose. He was mid-sermon when I entered, speaking words that should have been heretical, but sounded instead like simple truth. Better rations, safer working conditions, the recognition that they were human beings and not merely components in the Imperium's vast industrial machine. I waited until the crowd dispersed. Patience was part of the craft, but when I moved to complete the sanction, I saw the data slate on his table. It was open. Careless of him. Fatal. The screen displayed communications, Vox transcripts, names I recognized because they belonged to members of Inquisitor Vex's own retinue. My handler's name was there. Others I knew from the fortress on Gast. They were not hunting this cult. They were funding it, directing it, using it to identify malcontents who could then be disappeared, their absence blamed on the very reformist movement they had believed in. I should have looked away. I should have completed my mission and reported nothing. But I was young enough to still believe that truth mattered, that the Inquisition's purpose was justice rather than control. I downloaded the files to a data crystal I kept for emergency intelligence gathering. I completed the sanction on Crane, and I returned to the fortress believing I had uncovered corruption that needed to be exposed. My handler was waiting in the briefing chamber when I arrived. His name was Morton, and I had trusted him for 3 years. I began to make my report, to explain what I had discovered, to offer him the crystal that contained the evidence. He listened without interrupting. His face showed nothing. When I finished speaking, the silence stretched so long I thought perhaps the Vox system had failed. Then his eyes changed. Not with anger, not with surprise, with something colder. A kind of tired resignation, as if I had confirmed something he had already suspected. Something he had hoped would not be necessary to address. He did not speak to me again. He spoke into his Vox bead, words I could not quite hear. Within minutes, Arbites appeared at the chamber doors. Not the local enforcers, but the fortress guard. Men whose loyalty was to the Inquisition itself, rather than any concept of law. They moved with the efficient brutality of people executing a procedure they had performed many times before. I tried to explain. I tried to make them understand that I was loyal, that I had only been trying to serve the Emperor's truth. But the words died in my throat when I saw Morton's expression. He was not angry. He was not conflicted. He looked at me the way I had looked at targets before pulling the trigger, with professional detachment, with the cold assessment of a problem requiring solution. The restraints closed around my wrists. Mag locked, unbreakable. The Arbites pulled me toward the door without ceremony or explanation. I looked back at Morton, searching his face for some sign of regret, some indication that what was happening pained him. There was nothing. I did not yet know my fate, but I knew it would not be death. Death would be mercy. The Imperium does not waste useful flesh. The trial, if it could be called that, took place in a chamber I had never seen before. Deep in the fortress, where even the stones seemed to absorb sound. A single lumen flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved like living things across walls, carved with the names of the faithfully dead. I stood in mag-locked restraints before a tribunal of 3 figures whose faces I could barely see in the dim light. A tech priest stood to the left, his red robes pooling on the floor like spilled blood. He spoke in Binharic cant, a machine language of clicks and static that my unaugmented ears could not pass. But I understood his function. He was there to assess my physical viability for conversion, to determine if the flesh was worth salvaging. The Inquisitor in the center read the charges without meeting my eyes. His voice was flat, bored, as if he had delivered this same judgment 1,000 times before and would deliver it 1,000 times more. Unauthorized, intelligence gathering, possession of classified materials, failure to maintain proper informational discipline. Each phrase was technically accurate. Each phrase transformed loyalty into treason through the simple application of procedure. The sentence was delivered in terms so bureaucratic they felt obscene. Mind wipe, augmentation, reassignment to Servitor-Class asset with specialized assassination protocols. The words meant nothing to me at first. They were administrative language, the kind of phrasing used in requisition forms and supply manifests. It took several seconds for my mind to translate them into their true meaning. They were going to hollow me out and wear what remained. I tried to speak. I tried to plead, to explain that I had only been trying to serve, that my loyalty had never wavered, that everything I had done was in the Emperor's name. But my throat had closed. The words would not come. Perhaps they had already begun. Perhaps the process of unmanning me had started the moment the restraints closed, the moment Morton's eyes went cold, the moment I chose to look at what I should have ignored. They dragged me from the chamber without ceremony. The corridors blurred together as we descended, level after level, until we reached a Medicae facility that smelled of counterseptic and something else beneath it, something organic and wrong. The surgical slab they strapped me to was still warm. I could feel the heat of it against my back through my clothing. Someone had been here before me. Recently. I wondered if they had screamed. I wondered if I would. The first cut came without anesthetic, not across flesh, but into it. A needle sliding between my vertebrae with terrible precision. The pain was not sharp. It was wrong. It was the sensation of something fundamental being violated, of boundaries that should never be crossed being breached with clinical indifference. My body tried to thrash against the restraints. The restraints did not yield. Then came the injection. I felt it spreading through my nervous system like ice water, cascading down from the injection site, numbing everything it touched. My legs stopped responding. My arms went limp. My chest continued to rise and fall, but only because the paralytic had been calibrated to spare the autonomic systems. I could breathe. I could blink. I could feel everything, but I could not move. I could not even turn my head away. The tech priests entered my field of vision like red ghosts. They murmured prayers to the Omnissiah as they prepared their instruments. Rituals of sanctification spoken over scalpels and bone saws and devices whose purpose I could not guess. One of them leaned over me, his augmetic eyes whirring as they focused. He said something in Gothic, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Then they opened my skull. I heard the sound of the saw. I felt the vibration in my teeth, and I understood with absolute clarity what was happening. They were not going to let me die. They were not going to let me forget. Something worse was coming. Something worse came with the precision of ritual. The tech priests worked in silence, broken only by Binharic murmurs and the wet sounds of flesh being parted from bone. I felt them reach into my skull with instruments that hummed with electromagnetic fields. There was pressure, and then a sensation like something being gently tugged from inside my head. Not pain, exactly. Wrongness. The feeling of something essential being removed from where it had always belonged. They were excising portions of my frontal cortex, the parts that governed choice, the regions responsible for initiating voluntary action, for transforming thought into deed. I could feel each section being lifted away, could sense the space where personality used to live becoming hollow. And through it all, consciousness remained. Horribly, perfectly, aware. One of the tech priests spoke, his voice modulated through a vox grill that made it sound like it was coming from the bottom of a deep shaft. Willpower centers removed, personality matrix preserved, cognitive function nominal. He was not speaking to me. He was cataloging modifications for records that would file me under inventory rather than personnel. The installation of the augmetic interfaces felt like invasion. They threaded cables directly into my motor control centers, bypassing the neural pathways that had once connected intention to movement. I felt the foreign objects settling into gray matter, felt my brain trying to reject them, felt the immune suppressants flooding my system to prevent the rejection from succeeding. My body was learning to accept its chains at the cellular level. When they removed my eyes, I expected darkness. Instead, there was a moment of grey static, and then vision returned sharper and colder than before. The world became overlays of tactical data, distance measurements, threat assessments, optimal firing solutions calculated for targets that did not exist. I tried to close these new eyes, to shut out the flood of information. The eyes did not respond. They were not mine. The grafting of weapon systems into my forearms took hours. I felt them opening the flesh, felt the kiss of air on exposed muscle and bone. They installed the mechanisms with the care of artisans, murmuring prayers of sanctification as they bolted metal to skeleton. Micro-bolt launchers, monofilament wire dispensers, injection systems for toxins I could not name. Each addition made my arms heavier, foreign, until I could no longer recognize them as the hands that had once cleaned a blessed bolt pistol with sacred oils. They reinforced my bones with plasteel struts, drilling into femurs and tibias and vertebrae to insert support structures that would allow my frame to handle the stress of augmented muscle fiber. The drilling resonated through my entire skeleton. I felt like a building being retrofitted, a structure deemed useful enough to preserve but too flawed to remain unchanged. The worst came last. They installed reservoirs along my spine, small bladders filled with combat stimulants that could be released directly into my bloodstream on command. Not my command, someone else's. I felt the cold weight of them settling against my vertebrae, felt the tubes threading through muscle to connect with major arteries. My body was becoming a weapon system with life support, rather than a life that carried weapons. Through it all, consciousness remained. This was not an accident or an oversight. This was intentional. They were not making me into a mindless servitor who would shuffle through corridors on simple tasks until my organic components failed. They were making me into something worse, a consciousness trapped in a shell it could no longer command, aware enough to understand what had been taken, but not capable of resisting what remained. I could feel everything, but I could not move. I could think with perfect clarity, but I could not speak. My thoughts formed words that would never reach my tongue. My intentions generated impulses that died before reaching muscles that no longer answered to the mind that had grown them. The worst part was not the pain. The worst part came when the pain stopped. When the tech priests stepped back, and I heard one of them declare the procedure complete. When I realized that this was not a nightmare I would wake from. This was waking. This was forever. The transformation was finished. The unmaking was done. What remained was something that remembered being human, but would never be human again. What remained awakened like a faulty cogitator struggling to achieve full function. Consciousness flickered. Darkness. Light. Darkness again. Then awareness crashed into me with the weight of a falling hab block. I was standing in shadow, looking down at a crowded market square on a world whose name I did not know. The sun was bright. Too bright. My new eyes adjusted automatically, dimming the input, overlaying the scene with targeting grids and threat assessments that I had not requested and could not dismiss. I had no memory of arriving here, no recollection of the journey from the surgical slab to this shadowed alcove. My body had moved without me, had walked and climbed and positioned itself for optimal firing solution, while my consciousness was somewhere else, or nowhere at all. I was a passenger discovering I had been driving for hours without awareness of the road. The command came through the Vox link installed directly into my auditory cortex. Not a voice, exactly. More like the ghost of a voice. Words that bypassed my ears and appeared fully formed in my mind. Target acquired. Merchant. Blue robe. Xenos artifact smuggling. Sanction authorized. Execute. I tried to stop, I focused every fragment of will I possessed on staying still, on doing nothing, on refusing the command that had not been a request. My body began to move. My legs carried me down from the alcove with fluid silence. My hands reached for the monofilament wire dispenser installed in my left forearm. The mechanism activated with a soft click. I felt more than heard. 20 meters of wire, one molecule thick, capable of cutting through flesh and bone as if they were morning mist. "Stop!" I screamed inside my own head. "Stop moving! Stop walking! Stop preparing to kill!" The screaming made no difference. My body had its orders. My body had always had its orders. I had simply been too naive to understand that the orders would no longer route through anything I could recognize as choice. The target appeared exactly where my tactical systems had predicted he would. A merchant in a blue robe, his face weathered by years under alien suns, his hands stained with the dyes he used in his trade. He was haggling with a customer over the price of fabric, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of someone who had conducted this same negotiation 1,000 times. He looked kind. He looked harmless. He looked human. My body moved behind him with predatory grace. The wire extended between my hands. I tried to close my fists, to drop the wire, to do anything that would prevent what was about to happen. My hands did not respond. They belonged to someone else now. They belonged to the Imperium. The wire crossed his throat so quickly he did not have time to understand what was happening. I felt the resistance as it cut through skin, through muscle, through the vessels that carried blood to his brain. The sensation transmitted through the wire into my hands with perfect fidelity. Warm, wet, wrong. His body began to fall. My arms caught him with gentle precision, lowering him to the ground as if he were something precious rather than something ended. The people around us continued their commerce. No one had seen, no one had heard. The kill was clean. My body was already moving through the extraction route, calculated and executed by systems that operated below the threshold of consciousness, through alleys that smelled of waste and desperation, over walls that my augmented muscles scaled without effort, away from the scene with efficiency that would have made my mentors proud, back when pride was something I could feel rather than simply remember feeling. And as I fled through those nameless streets, understanding settled over me like ash from a Promethean fire. This was my existence now. I would kill for the Imperium forever. I would remember every face, every drop of blood, every moment of helpless complicity. I would feel guilt and shame and horror with perfect clarity. But I would never stop. I would never refuse. I would never be anything other than a weapon that remembered what it was like to have been a man. This was my service. This was my eternity. This was the price of seeing what I should have ignored. The missions came one after another, and each one burned itself into memory with perfect, agonizing clarity. A planetary governor on Malthus Secundus who spoke too openly of labor reform and fair taxation. I found him in his bedchamber, asleep beside a wife who would wake to find him cold. The garrote wire crossed his throat while he dreamed. He did not wake. His last breath was a small sigh, almost peaceful, and I felt the warmth leave his skin as I held him still until the protocols confirmed termination. My body left through the window it had entered. The wife slept on. In the morning, she would discover that reform dies as easily as the men who speak its name. A rogue preacher on Sanctus VII, whose sermons questioned the ecclesiarchy's interpretation of the imperial creed. He believed faith should comfort rather than control. He believed the emperor would want his children to know joy instead of only duty. Heresy, according to the orders transmitted into my skull. I approached during communion, just another supplicant in the crowd seeking the emperor's blessing. The poison was in my palm, water-soluble, fast-acting. When he pressed the chalice to my lips, I let a single drop fall from my hand into the wine. He took his own communion 30 seconds later. He collapsed at the altar, blood running from his nose and eyes. The congregation screamed. My body walked calmly toward the exit while my mind screamed with them. A child on Vicos Prime, no more than 12 years old. The psychic potential had manifested 3 days prior. Small objects moving when she was frightened, lights flickering when she cried. The black ships would come for her eventually, but my handlers deemed her too dangerous to wait. I found her in a dormitory where orphans of industrial accidents were housed until they were old enough to join the labor tithes. She was asleep. She looked peaceful. My hands closed around her throat just as they had around the merchants, around the governors, around so many others. She woke. She looked at me with eyes that did not understand. That was worse somehow. The merchant had known fear. The governor had known guilt. The preacher had known conviction. The child knew only confusion. "Why are you hurting me?" her expression asked. I had no answer. My hands continued their work until the question faded from her eyes along with everything else. I was good at this. My body was efficient, precise, artful in its lethality. Each kill was executed with a perfection that would have been impossible for the person I used to be. No hesitation, no error, no mercy. And with each termination, the small part of me that remained human screamed silently, trapped behind eyes that could no longer weep, hands that could no longer tremble. But something else was happening, something worse than the killing. I began to notice that my thoughts were slower, more fragmented. The internal voice that narrated my horror was growing fainter, harder to hear beneath the constant stream of tactical data that now constituted most of my awareness. Threat assessment, firing solution, extraction route. The machinery was louder than the man. Memories from my previous life were fading like old parchment left in sunlight. I could remember the fortress on Gast, but I could no longer recall the smell of the incense in my quarters. I remembered Cassia, my mentor, but her face was becoming indistinct, replaced by probability matrices and combat algorithms. I remembered taking oaths before a chaplain, but I could no longer hear the words I had spoken. And then came the realization that froze whatever remained of my soul. I tried to remember my name, the name my parents had given me before they died. The name Cassia had spoken with something approaching warmth. The name that had appeared on mission reports and blessing scrolls and the small shrine I had maintained. It was gone, overwritten, replaced by an asset designation number that appeared in my vision whenever I accessed system diagnostics. I was no longer a person with a name. I was Unit 7-Theta-9. The terror of this discovery exceeded every horror I had experienced since the unmaking began. They were not just enslaving me, they were erasing me, slowly, degree by degree, until nothing remained but the weapon and the ghost of awareness that knew what it had lost, but could no longer remember what that loss had been. The mission that followed was different from the moment consciousness flickered online. The orders came through the Vox link with the same mechanical precision as always. Target designation, former inquisitorial operative, declared renegade, reasons classified, eliminate on sight. But there was something in the data packet that made the fragmented thing I had become pause. Not physically. My body was already moving, already executing the approach protocols. But somewhere in the dissolving core of what remained, recognition stirred like something waking from deep sleep. The safe house was on a desert world whose name the tactical overlay identified as Varos Dust. The structure was half buried in sand, camouflaged to blend with the endless dunes that stretched toward a horizon, shimmering with heat. My body approached through the killing hours before dawn, when the cold made thermal signatures stand out like candles in darkness. The door opened to corridors carved from compressed sand and stone, and with each step, something wrong happened. I remembered these corridors, not these specific walls, but the feeling of them, the architecture, the way the passages turned at angles designed to create kill zones and fallback positions. This was inquisitorial construction, standard safe house configuration. I had trained in places like this. I had been taught to navigate them, to clear them room by room, to recognize the hidden alcoves where an operative could make a final stand. The memories should not have been there. They should have been overwritten by now, replaced by tactical subroutines and targeting solutions. But they persisted, flickering at the edges of awareness, like a lumen dying slowly rather than all at once. The target was in the deepest chamber, lit by a single glow globe that cast more shadow than light. When my body rounded the corner and my targeting optics locked onto the figure, something in the remaining organic portions of my brain screamed in recognition. I knew this face. The features were older, worn by stress and time and whatever circumstances had led to the renegade designation. But I knew them, had known them. A comrade from the fortress on Gast. Someone who had trained alongside me in those deep chambers where the weight of stone felt like blessing. Someone whose name was gone from my memory, but whose presence remained like a scar that ached in cold weather. They recognized me too. I watched the recognition move across their face in stages. Confusion, realization, horror. The horror was worse than any weapon I had ever faced. It was the look of someone seeing a friend's corpse animated by something that wore their skin. They spoke. Their voice was hoarse, desperate. "Matthias," they said. The name meant nothing to me. Then I understood. That had been my name, before the asset designation, before the unmaking. Matthias. Matthias, stop, please. I know you're still in there. I know you can hear me. Fight it. Remember who you were. Remember what we believed in. My body continued its approach. My right hand was rising. The micro-bolt launcher installed in my palm was charging. The targeting solution was calculated. Center mass. 97% probability of immediate termination. I tried to stop. I focused every remaining fragment of will on freezing my muscles, on preventing my finger from completing the firing sequence. For one agonizing moment, I felt something shift. Some ghost of agency stirring in the depths of my imprisoned consciousness. A tremor in the iron chains that bound intention to action. My hand stopped rising. For half a second, maybe less, but it stopped. The targeting reticle wavered, the firing solution recalculated, and in that half second, I felt something that might have been hope. Then the shot fired. The recoil traveled up my arm. The bolt crossed the distance between us faster than thought. It took them in the chest. They fell backward, their expression frozen in that moment of recognition, of pleading, of desperate hope that the person they had known still existed somewhere inside this shell of meat and augmetics. I understood then with absolute clarity. Even awareness was not enough. Even the ghost of will was not enough. I was not a person wearing chains. I was the chains themselves. The distinction between prisoner and prison had collapsed so completely that there was no longer a boundary between the two. The weapon was not something I carried. The weapon was what I had become. The body that carried what remained of Matthias did not move immediately after the kill. This had never happened before. The extraction protocols should have initiated automatically, carrying me away from the scene with mechanical efficiency. But I stood motionless over the corpse of someone I had known, someone whose name I could not recall, but whose memory lived in the spaces between the tactical overlays. Something had changed. Perhaps the half-second of resistance had damaged systems not designed to tolerate resistance. Perhaps the weight of accumulated trauma had finally cracked something in the augmetic architecture that controlled me. Or perhaps the organic components of my brain had simply reached their limit, the final threshold beyond which even conditioning could not push. I felt it like a tremor in deep stone. Control, not much, not full autonomy, but the ability to pause, to turn my head without command, to feel the faint ghost of choice stirring in neural pathways that had been silent since the unmaking. The next mission came 3 days later. A cathedral on Mortem Prime. A priest accused of heresy for preaching that the Emperor's mercy extended even to those who doubted. The orders were clear. Terminate during evening prayer when the congregation would be largest. Maximum psychological impact. Let the faithful see what happens to those who soften the imperial creed with dangerous compassion. My body carried me through the cathedral doors as the sun set beyond stained glass windows that depicted the Emperor in all his glory. Saints and martyrs gazed down from panels that transformed dying light into rivers of gold and crimson. The priest stood at the altar, his voice raised in prayer, speaking words about love and forgiveness that sounded like heresy only because we had forgotten they had once been considered virtues. The congregation knelt in reverence. My targeting systems identified optimal firing positions. The micro-bolt launcher in my palm charged. The shot was calculated. From this angle, this distance, the priest would die before he finished his next sentence. The congregation would scatter. Some would survive to spread the tale of divine punishment for straying from orthodox faith. Efficient, clean, exactly what I had been remade to accomplish. But I did not move to the firing position. The ghost of control that had awakened after the last kill was stronger now, growing, spreading through systems that had been locked against anything resembling choice. I could feel my body responding to impulses that originated from something deeper than programming. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. I walked down the center aisle instead, past congregants who glanced up with curiosity rather than fear, toward the altar where the priest continued his prayer about mercy and redemption and the possibility that even the fallen might be worthy of the Emperor's love. I did not raise my weapon. I did not calculate firing solutions. Instead, I knelt before the golden aquila that dominated the space above the altar. The priest's prayer faltered. The congregation grew silent. They were watching me, this augmented thing that had entered their sacred space, trying to understand what I was and why I knelt like a supplicant, rather than standing like the weapon I had become. I accessed the failsafe protocols buried deep in my system architecture. Every Servitor-Class asset carried them. Self-destruct measures meant to prevent capture, to ensure that Imperial technology did not fall into enemy hands. They required authorization codes, but the codes were stored in my own memory, accessible to handlers who could trigger them remotely. The systems had not anticipated that the weapon itself might choose its own destruction. I triggered the sequence. The pain was immense and brief, fire spreading through every augmented system, every reinforced bone, every reservoir of combat stims suddenly flooding my bloodstream with compounds designed to shut down organic functions. My body convulsed once, then went still. As consciousness began to fade, I felt something I had not experienced since before the unmaking. Peace. Not salvation, not redemption, but the simple, profound relief of ending. The weapon was broken. The killing was finished. No more faces, no more blood, no more screaming in the prison of my own skull. My last thought was not of regret. It was gratitude. The ghost was free. The darkness that followed was not empty. I existed in it, or something that had been me existed. Consciousness without flesh, awareness without the prison of augmented meat and servitor protocols. Perhaps this was death. Perhaps it was only the final moments of a brain deprived of oxygen, creating meaning from the random firing of dying neurons. It did not matter. In this space between ending and whatever came after, I could finally think without the machinery drowning out thought. I understood things now that I could not have understood while trapped in the shell they had made. The Imperium's cruelty was not malicious, it was mechanical. No one who ordered my conversion hated me. No one took pleasure in what they had unmade. They simply saw a problem and applied the most efficient solution. I had seen what I should not have seen. I possessed skills that remained useful. Therefore, I would be repurposed. The logic was flawless. The horror was incidental. My suffering had not been personal. It had been procedural. Somewhere in the archives of the Inquisition, there existed forms documenting my conversion. Requisition orders for augmetic components. Surgical reports filed by tech priests who recorded my transformation with the same detachment they would use to document the repair of a damaged servitor. My screams, if they had been recorded at all, were probably classified as expected biological responses to standard procedures. In a galaxy of endless war, even personhood is a resource to be exploited, refined, and spent. The Imperium cannot afford waste. It cannot afford mercy. It cannot afford to let useful flesh go unused simply because the consciousness inhabiting that flesh would prefer oblivion to service. Every body is a potential soldier. Every mind is a potential servitor. Every life is raw material waiting to be processed into something more useful than happiness or freedom or choice. I thought of the others like me, former soldiers who failed at crucial moments, agents who witnessed truths too dangerous to remember, pilots who survived crashes that should have killed them, tech adepts who questioned doctrines they should have accepted, all of them unmade, all of them repurposed, all of them serving without choice, suffering without voice, existing in that terrible space between death and life where consciousness persists, but autonomy has been surgically removed. How many of us were there? Thousands, millions, scattered across a galaxy of 1,000,000 worlds, performing functions too subtle or too terrible for regular servitors, killing in shadows, maintaining systems in depths where living humans could not survive, operating machinery that required just enough awareness to adapt but not enough will to refuse. We were the Imperium's ghost workforce, the ones who served forever because we had been denied the mercy of being allowed to stop. There was no anger left in me, only understanding. The system that destroyed me was not evil, it was efficient, and efficiency, in the grim darkness of the far future, is the only virtue that matters. The Imperium faces extinction from 1,000 directions. Chaos presses in from the warp. Xenos devour worlds at the galaxy's edge. Heresy blooms in the hearts of the faithful. Against such threats, individual suffering becomes a rounding error. My pain was nothing measured against the survival of the species. Somewhere, on some distant world, another Servitor-Class assassin closes augmented hands around another throat. Another consciousness screams silently behind eyes that do not weep. Another weapon performs its function with terrible perfection, while the ghost trapped inside watches in helpless horror. The wheel turns. The killing continues. The Imperium endures. And in the shadows of its endless machinery, in the spaces between cogitator clicks and servo-skull whispers, the ghosts of the unmade watch in silence. We cannot warn the living. We cannot save those who will follow us into unmaking. We cannot even close our eyes against the parade of horrors we have witnessed and participated in. We can only watch, and remember, and understand. There is only war. In war, resources must be maximized, Efficiency must be maintained. Waste cannot be tolerated. And mercy, that most precious and dangerous of human impulses, becomes just another weapon that can be taken away when the Imperium decides it is no longer useful. The darkness deepens. The ghost fades. But somewhere, the killing continues. It always does. It always will. Until the last human draws the last breath in service to an empire that will grind even that final exhalation into something useful. The Emperor protects, and we, the unmade, are the price of his protection.